pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, right? And the more unattached you are, these are things that just happen. They don't define you. They don't become who you are. You are not them. You're just the person who experiences things. And the worst thing that happens is nothing changes. But it's not good now. Like, why would you stand in a fire and be like, I really think I should get out of this fire, but I'm going to stay and get burned a little more. Like, okay, then I hope it gets worse for you so that you get out of the damn fire.
Hey guys, if you missed out on the last conference in Nashville, Tennessee, you don't want to miss out on the next one. It's April 28th through May 3rd, Orlando, Florida, the Gaylord Palms Resort and Convention Center. You made a mistake missing the last one. You don't want that to happen again on this one. 5 days of some of the best training you're ever going to experience packed into one event. We have an early bird special right now, $50 off. Use 24 early bird on our website, streetcop.com. Look for the conference, click the link, register today. If you want to get significantly better at this profession in 5 days, don't dare miss out on the 2024 Street Cop Conference.
111, 110.
Training to be a street cop.
Hey guys, welcome to this episode of the Street Cop Training Podcast. I'm your host, founder, and CEO of Street Cop Training. My name is Dennis Benino, and we have with us today somebody whose name is interesting because of what
Amanda
she teaches.
Chils.
Yeah, Amanda Chils,
Yeah.
which is probably the most appropriate name for somebody who does what you do. But I appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast. I think she was a little caught off guard that I was just going to fucking start.
I mean, listen, I'm ready to party whenever. Like, benefits of having a great nervous system that's well regulated is like we just vibe and it's good.
That's how I feel as well.
Yeah.
It's rare. My nervous system was a little unregulated maybe 3 weeks ago, but I'm happy to report within the past 7 days, I have resumed back to my normal 72 BPM, 120 over 70 blood pressure. So I'm just a very calm human being.
Your primary care must be very happy with you. They're like, these numbers.
They're so happy that I don't even have one.
Right. Well, not with those numbers. You don't need one.
So Amanda, tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah.
And how the fuck we ended up here together.
Absolutely. I will meander down this with you. So I'm a therapist and I work a lot with first responders. So a few years ago, I had a client come who is a paramedic. And they were like, I keep having nightmares. I just keep having nightmares and I'm not functioning. So I'm like, oh, well, like, don't they have someone who helps you after you run, bad calls, does like crisis debriefing, all those things? And they were like, yeah, no, that's not a thing. And I was like, the fuck do you mean that's not a thing? Like, what do you mean? And she was like, no, it's like not a thing that they do. And I was like, well, that's fucking stupid. And I hate that. So it made me really mad. And I can like be mad about things or I can help. So I'm also someone who has a lot of initiating energy. So I was like, well, fuck this. I'll just fix it. So I contacted our like county first responders and I was like, hey, your people are suffering. Like, this is not okay. I can help. And they were like, who are you? And I was like, someone who can help, like, come talk to me. And so I started working a ton with first responders and I just like adore them as human beings. So that's kind of how I found you. I was like, oh, like, let first responders know that like, one, it doesn't have to be this hard. Like the way that things have been doesn't have to be the way that things are. And we can just like eliminate and alleviate suffering that like can come with the job, but doesn't have to. So I found you and I was like, dope, let's party and vibe. Cause like, obviously you're talking to the right, perfect people. So here we are partying in real life. How fun.
Tell me about you. Where did you grow up? How did you get into therapy?
Yeah. So I grew up in Florida. And I live in North Carolina now on a farm, which is like a total vibe. So I was just keeping my minis from biting a client because they're the most chaotic little gremlins. We have one that likes to steal people's keys. And I'm like, don't do that. We're working. And he's like, I don't care. Cause he DGAF. So I grew up in Florida and I initially wanted to train service dogs. So my heart really belongs to like veterans and first responders. Cause I'm like, y'all give so much and end up getting screwed a lot. And I'm just like, that's not okay. That's not okay. So I wanted to train service dogs and I went to a service dog training facility and it was super, super sterile. And I was like, ew, gross. This feels like a hospital. That's not my vibe. And then I found an equine assisted therapy facility in Odessa, Florida, that works a lot with like MacDill Air Force Base. And I was like, oh, I can be a therapist, which means I don't have to do organic chemistry to do like physical therapy. So I was like, yeah, there's no way I'm going to pass organic chemistry. Well, I would want to die. So I was like, oh, I can do mental health, work with horses, work with veterans, heal trauma, like fucking sign me up. So did that, went to school, moved to North Carolina, and then I get to do it all day long. And it's dope AF. And we love that.
So you said earlier that you adore first responders. What do you adore about them?
One, their sense of humor is typically pretty dark. So I can vibe with that. I'm like, yeah, like you see really fucked up shit. So like the one option is to laugh about it, one option is to cry about it and break down under the pressure. And that's obviously the worst, the not as good option. So one, I think people who run headfirst into serving others is incredible. It's not work that I could do, but where I am very useful is in supporting and in clearing trauma. But the heart for service is so powerful. The community is beautiful. Like really it's the heart for service and like being willing to dedicate your life to truly serving others and like being good in a crisis, if that makes sense. Like it's so interesting because they're so regulated in so many ways. And then there's some areas where like, because of the nature of the job, because of the way it like sits on their system and like gets like data comes into mind, that they're so good in like running into a fire or like dealing with someone who's incredibly escalated or dangerous, but then it causes problems in other areas. And like, I really hate to see suffering. And I especially hate to see suffering for people that dedicate their lives to other people. And there aren't super great systems to support. So I'm like, okay, well, that's where I can be incredibly useful.
So what is your goal as a therapist when you speak with a client generally?
To be as effective as I can is kind of like the broad intention, and that they're happy and satisfied over time. So not only is there a shift immediately when I'm with them, but that it lasts over time. So really it's to alleviate suffering. And so the way that happens is like, essentially it's like multi-level communication. So I'm not only talking to conscious, I'm talking to unconscious as well. So you've experienced, I'm sure, where people are like, oh, I know that this doesn't make sense. I know that what I'm doing isn't helpful. I know blah, 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 blah. But then they're still doing the unhelpful thing. They're still like struggling in some area. And that's because unconscious has not gotten the message that conscious already knows. So it's like people will know like, oh, I'll know that if I'm sitting in a restaurant with my family, there's no need to scan a crowd. There's no big need to be tense, to be bracing, which is something I see all the time. People will like unconsciously brace all the time because obviously at work, anything could happen at any moment. So it's very beneficial to brace. But off work, that causes a problem, right? So it's like a snake is coiled when there's actually a threat. But if a snake were coiled 24/7, it would just starve to death. So that's not very useful. But people have trouble switching it off. So really what I do well and what I focus on is their ability to adapt to the environment. So when it's time to be on, bracing, ready, vigilant, then that's the useful thing to do. When it's not necessary, then it's not happening. So like, pulling someone over, dealing with like someone who's escalated, running into a fire, going into a troublesome call, very useful to be very incredibly aware of your surroundings, ready for anything, thinking on the spot, all the things. But like when you're hanging out at a park with your family, like not that useful. It actually just gets in the way of being present in your life. So I just want people to be present in their life and fully live it rather than being on like so burned out that they're on autopilot all the time.
How does a therapist speak to an unconscious brain?
Yeah, so it's a very specific language that I use. So there's some ways like, for example, anything they experience, I'm shifting the language to create separation from it. So for example, I had a client that I was just working with and we were doing some work around something that like a memory that came up for them when they were younger. And so most people will say, I was I was doing this. And the goal is to create separation between that. So it's they were experiencing that. What were they experiencing? You have been experiencing XYZ, or people will come and they'll say, I'm depressed. And the worst fucking thing I can say is, oh, you are depressed. Yes, you are so depressed. And it's like, oh, it's just like dumping chlorine into a rose bush. Like it just makes no sense. So saying you've been experiencing what feels like depression, you've been experiencing anxiety, you've been experiencing racing thoughts. So it creates a lot of distance between what they're experiencing and what they have been identifying with. Because what we identify with, mind goes, oh, well, there's no work to do here. This is who we are. I'm not going to change, which obviously that's not very helpful. If someone's like, oh, I just don't feel emotions ever. And it's like, you do, they just get stored, they get shoved down, but humans are pressure cookers and it will release pressure whatever way it can. So language is a very specific thing. I do it through creating like a lot of connections. So obviously there's a lot of like making sure that I get what they're saying, not just what they're saying in words, but what they're really saying underneath it. So it's a lot of getting to the root of what's been happening for them. And then once that's understood, then I can create shifts. And then the clients like don't do the work. Like the work is on me to create the shift. It's not like they're having to do this huge thing. Like the work is on me to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Oh my God. Every time I have a therapist on, we go into the, does that make sense? And I start doing that as well.
Well,
I start exploring things. Yeah.
Heard, right? Sometimes I'm explaining something and people are like, why are you talking about cats? And I'm like, I'm talking about the Roman Empire. And they're like, well, that's not what landed. And I'm like, well, shit, I better make sure it's clear then.
What are some symptoms that a first responder may not know about or could be less obvious to that first responder that they may be experiencing and maybe not even experiencing consciously some of the things that are going through their body that are disrupting their limbic system and their nervous system? And I can speak to this because I do meditate. Mm-hmm. And so what's interesting about meditation is as I begin to calm my body down, you'd be surprised what you recognize how tense you are all the time. So it's pretty wild.
Some people are all the time or have been. Yeah.
Well, even for me, who I believe I'm very, very not tense, it's amazing how some thoughts will tense your body up immediately. So I, through my meditation practice, will constantly scan my body to make sure I am completely relaxed. And so this happens for me over and over again as I go through my practice. But it's interesting when you first start doing it to recognize like, oh my God, my butt cheeks are clenched all the fucking time. It sounds so weird, but you don't even realize you're doing it.
Yeah. So what I see most often is that people will brace 24/7. And because it's their normal, like if you grow up in a house that speaks Spanish, Spanish becomes the language that you speak, right? So if you have been bracing all the time, they don't even know that they're bracing all the time because there's no unbrace to compare to. So once people come down, then they're like, oh, fuck. What is this? And then what happens is because mind has been programmed to be on high alert 24/7, when they come down, they'll typically ramp back up because the nervous system will come down. It will get read as unsafe in the mind. And then mind will say, that feels vulnerable. Nope. I'm going to put the protection up. So people don't even realize how much they've been protecting because again, it makes sense to do when you're at work. It makes sense to do if you have a history of abuse, any of those things, which a lot of first responders have, but it doesn't make sense when there's no actual threat present. So people have been bracing and what happens is it's kind of like if you're sifting, if you like take a big filter and you sift a bunch of things, like obviously the bigger rocks are going to come through first and then the smaller rocks and the smaller rocks. So what comes through first is the big stuff. Oh, this call that I ran or this particular traumatic experience that I went through or this fight with my partner or XYZ, this loss that I experienced. So once those start to come through, other things will start popping up. So a lot of things that I see is that they've been tense all the time. Nightmares is, people obviously know when they're experiencing nightmares, but nightmares is something that comes through all the time. And sometimes will come through a little while after I start working with people because subconscious is finally bringing things to the surface to filter and work through. But if they're not working through it consciously, it will come through unconsciously. But the only time your conscious is really offline is when you're asleep. So subconscious is like, oh, great, time to work through these things. And then people are like, why am I having nightmares? And I'm like, well, we got to work through some shit consciously. That's fine. So nightmares is something. Not experiencing emotions is probably the thing that I see the most often, or they only experience anger. Like that's really the only emotion they can access. And the other ones are shut off. So like I had a client, for example, that was so shut off they couldn't feel cold. Like it would be 30, 40 degrees and they're in short sleeves. And I'm like, are you cold? And they're like, no, I don't feel anything. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we have so much work to do. That stresses me out. So people will shut off. And then of course, if you don't experience any emotions, you experience no emotions, right? So people will shut off in order to protect from pain, grief, sadness, loss, but it's not like you pick and choose. Like those people are shut off from everything, which really makes you an observer of life rather than someone who's like actively participating in life, which makes you really, really sad. Like life is so good and it's meant to be experienced, not just observed.
I think maybe sometimes when people are in the mix of something very difficult, they may not appreciate life for how wonderful it is until that time subsides or passes and they begin to appreciate life again.
Well, and appreciation is a choice at all times, right? Like whether people believe they can handle all the emotions that come with an experience is separate from can they actually handle it? Of course, no one's going to die, right? Like the body always tends towards stabilization. So they won't literally die, but people feel like they're going to die. So mind goes, oh shit, I don't want to die. So I'm going to protect, which everything is in service of protection. So like, thank you, mind. But it's kind of like, if I'm scared of a little bird and I have a bazooka, like it's kind of overkill, right? It doesn't really make a ton of sense. So yes, of course it can be difficult. Like when you're going through a tough time to have appreciation, but appreciation is a choice. Like that's a choice that people make to notice things that are good, to notice things that are going well, where life doesn't feel like terrible. Because that's a choice people can make. And the more you look for something, the more you're going to see it. Like if you start thinking about buying a yellow Jeep, you're going to start seeing yellow Jeeps everywhere. But mind is programmed to find the negative because it's in protection mode. Oh, if I find the negative, then I can protect from it. But it actually typically ends up the other way around where people find the negative, look for the negative, find the negative, and then that's all they see because what we notice and appreciate expands. So yeah, people can definitely experience appreciation, but it is like, it's a skill and a choice.
Is trauma something that ever goes away, or is it just something that we learn to manage? And what's the best tools for that? Either to manage it in the beginning and get it to go away, or if it resurfaces, right?
Not always, no. So can it go away or can it be managed? It can be both. It can go away and it can be managed. Obviously, I recommend just clearing it. So this is where like the type of modality that I use is called rapid resolution therapy is very, very useful because it will clear the turmoil that had been experienced along with the memory of the traumatic experience. So when we experience something, it's always like we're processing incoming data, right? So processor is unconscious. So most of the data that we take in is unconscious, which is why we can kind of like get a sense without consciously having a sense, right? If you walked into a room and you're like, something's not right here, like that's unconscious speaking. So when a traumatic experience happens, mind blows up the data because if, someone's holding a knife to me, the biggest threat is the knife and the person. So that's what I'm going to remember, not going to necessarily remember the color of their shoes. So that data becomes so big that it gets stuck and we can just clear the data. So rapid resolution therapy, what it does is it clears the data. So it becomes something that happened, it's in the past. And because mind understands it's something that happened, that it's not happening, it didn't just happen, and it's not about to happen, there's nothing that needs to be done. So you've heard of flashbacks, of course. Okay, so when people experience flashbacks, they often will say like, oh, I feel like I'm there, because subconscious doesn't exist in time. Trauma pulls things out of time. So mind thinks, oh shit, it's happening now. I better generate anger, fear, energy, adrenaline in order to deal with a threat, but there's no actual threat there, right? So when I say yes, trauma can be cleared, what I mean is there is no somatic experience. There is no unconscious experience. It becomes something that happened. It gets reintegrated into a timeline, but there is no impulse or thought from mind that anything needs to happen now. So let's say I experienced a horrible car crash when I was 14 with a semi. And maybe for 10 years, every time I passed a semi, my mind was like, oh, dang, I better be careful around this semi. I would get nervous around a semi because mind understood that semi equaled danger versus semi is just a car on the road. There's 100 cars on the road. It was a freak accident. So when you clear trauma, there's no somatic experience. I can drive by a semi, I can drive next to a semi, I can pass a semi on the highway, and it's just complete neutrality. Does that make sense? It's a lot of things at once. And then it can be managed via things like breath work, things like grounding techniques, things like mantras, things like anything that is going to call you into the present moment is very useful, but it has to be interesting enough to keep mind engaged, but not so hard that it feels like a failure. So you've perhaps heard of like the grounding techniques where it's like 5 things you see and 4 things you can touch. Have you heard of that?
No.
Okay, so there's a very popular one that's like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And now that I said it and you don't know it, I'm going to probably mess one of them up. But it's like 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can smell. It calls in the senses, right? The purpose is that it grounds you in the present moment. For someone like me who gets bored easily, that doesn't really work well for my brain because I'm like, boring. But so I like to do one that's like 5 things I could steal and nobody would notice, which is interesting and engaging enough that my mind is like, oh, now we're playing a game. And if I'm playing a game, I'm not running from a bear. Because you would not be running from a bear being like, what can I steal in this forest that the bear wouldn't notice I was stealing? So anything that grounds you in the present moment is a useful way to manage, because we want you to be reintegrated into the timeline. And the timeline obviously is the present moment, so that mind understands there's nothing that needs to be done because the threat is perceived, not real.
Part of my meditation practice is, and anybody can take this online if they'd like, through her YouTube channels. It's Emily Fletcher Ziva Meditation. Mm-hmm. And so what we do is we go into the thing that you're touching that feels the heaviest and the lightest thing. So essentially, I'm sitting in a chair. I can feel the chair on my back and my legs. And then maybe there's a slight breeze in the room. So it's the most significant touch and the lightest touch. Yeah. Sound. What's the loudest thing you're hearing? What's the thing you're hearing off in the distance? So, and what do you smell? What do you taste? And then we actually go into what do you see? So you gotta, with your eyes closed though. So you got to start seeing things with your eyes closed. Typically what I'd like to do is like roll my eyes back a little bit and try to put myself into more of a, relaxed state. Cause I think the human body essential, or I think that we sleep with our eyes rolled back in the back of our heads. Isn't that correct? So I try to get there to try to go into a deep meditative state, into the bliss field, which is hard to get to. But then I start calling my mantra and trying to bring my thoughts in. All those
things, keep your mind engaged, and they're interesting enough that you're engaged, which means if you're here, you're not over there, right? If you're here, you're not running from a bear. If you're meditating, mind understands that like there's no threat present, because otherwise, why the hell would you be meditating? That doesn't make any sense. So anything that calls you into the present moment, people can do it through pain. Which is why people will often, like people who have experienced trauma will self-harm, because pain is incredibly grounding. And it's also a pressure release, because if the only way that you experience emotions is through pain or anger, then mind is pretty smart. So it'll cause you to do those 2 things in order to release pressure. But there's obviously much more useful ways, like learning to feel emotions and to ride those waves versus avoiding them or shutting them down. But keeping mind engaged in the present moment is perfect.
So do you exclusively see first responders?
No, not exclusively. I do have a fair amount of them, and my practice sees a fair amount of them, which is so fun. But no, not only them.
Once you were discovered in the law enforcement community or first responder community, how many people began to recognize that there was an available channel to go get some of this stuff worked out and started calling you? Yeah,
a lot, a lot. So I got hooked in with 911 and EMS first, and law enforcement was a little harder. I mean, you understand the community, and I was coming in as an outsider, right? So people were like, feelings, no thank you. Outsider, no thank you. So I was like, okay, I like to think of it as like a fungus. Like I'm going to grow on people over time, the more useful that I am. So I was just like, okay, well, let me be useful. And eventually they'll be like, oh, maybe she's not so bad. So we had a lot at first. It was really interesting working within an organization because we could see it grow throughout the organization. So once we were useful for one person, they told one person, they told one person, and then of course it becomes a spider web. But we get like a fair amount now, and it's because we've been useful and effective. So it's like, if we were terrible, nobody would call us, which I hope they wouldn't if we were bad. But it's been a steady stream, and it's been lovely to have more law enforcement because they were a little harder. Like their culture is just a little different. But now that they've opened up to having support, and we do therapy in a very, very untraditional way. Like I'm not a traditional therapist where like I just sit in a field and listen. I'm like, if that's what you're looking for, like go talk, I don't know, go talk to a horse in a field. They're free. Like they're way cheaper than paying someone to just sit and listen to you. Because where I focus on is in clearing trauma and in skill building. So not only do I want to clear the trauma, I want to teach them to fire me, which is the entire point of the process for me. Is like eventually they fire me and they're like, cool, I don't need you anymore because I handle everything. And I'm like, yes, great. That's exactly what I want.
Mm-hmm. Hey guys, follow us on all social media platforms to include Instagram, Twitter, Facebook group. We have so much information going out every single day, and we don't want you to miss out on any of that stuff. So check it out. Go give us a follow. What made you get into therapy? Because I always find that there's typically therapists have interesting backgrounds of what provoked them to get into this.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to do, and I knew I wanted to work with veterans, I looked into doing first physical therapy, but I would have had to take organic chemistry. So I was like, ew, I'd rather eat bees than do organic chemistry. But once I found the Therapeutic Writing Center they're an incredible program. They're called Quantum Leap. They're just outside of Tampa. They had a physical therapist on staff, an occupational therapist, a speech therapist, and mental health therapist. And I was like, please pay me to dig around in people's brains all day long and be nosy as heck and get like paid for it. So then I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to do that and I'm going to do it forever. So I like literally get paid to like dig around and, well, maybe that's a bad analogy. I get paid to like untangle the spaghetti of people's brains and be like, here, it doesn't have to be spaghetti. It can be neutral. You can just be neutral about most things that were used to be problematic and then totally engage in life in the way that you want to, because now you're clear of all that old programming or all of those open tabs that were taking energy, but now they're no longer taking energy. So you can put your energy where you want to put it, which is doing whatever lights you up, which is amazing.
That's interesting.
Thanks.
And so where do your typical sessions occur? At your house?
Yeah, so I live on a farm, and I do sessions out at the farm. So we've got like 11 horses and a bunch of goats that get out every day because they're bastards, and 2 donkeys. And so we actually do them out at the farm, which has been, it was intentional, but I didn't think it would be as helpful as it's been because we're outside, literally sitting in a field. I tend to go in the field with the horses. So there's like something to look at that's not just me in a room. It's immediately disarming. Like it disarms people. So they come, they sit, they're outside. It's a vibe. There's interesting things to look at. There's an ebb and a flow. Like it just immediately brings people down. So all of us work out at the farm, which has been wonderful.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can give some exercises that people who may be experiencing something could work through, like a breathing technique to calm their system down.
Sure.
They're experiencing something traumatic in the moment. So basically like a organic Xanax without the Xanax.
Yeah, so that's 2 separate things, right? So we'll do both. One for people that are experiencing, we'll just say like an escalated nervous system, maybe is like the useful way to say that. And then we'll do, if it's okay, like something that seems very overwhelming in the moment. I have found a useful definition of trauma to be something that overwhelms the ability to cope, even though people survive it. So there is some coping, but in a helpful way. So for people that are experiencing like an escalated nervous system, like they feel anxious, they feel activated, they feel like just up. 1, grounding. So putting attention and awareness on literally anything else. Like anything else would be useful than feeding that sensation. So I have told people to like eat sand, like a little facetiously. I'm like, do whatever you have to do to come into the moment. Touch is one of the most useful and quickest ways to do that. Balance is another. So I'll also have people, because we want them out of their head and into their body in a grounded way. So I'll have people stand on one leg because it will force mind to focus on keeping balance, which means mind is interested and engaged versus wrapped up in that sensation. So balancing can be quite useful. Eliciting some sort of pain response that won't actually hurt them long term is useful. Like they can pinch this little pressure point between their thumb and first finger. They can hold an ice cube in their hand until it melts. Another, if they're experiencing that, they can just take an inhale. Because so think about this somatically, right? If you're breathing slow and even, you're not running from a bear. And so mind understands that those two things cannot happen at once. So slow, even breathing, and on their exhale, thinking the word release. And mind understands that command to release anything that's not helpful. They don't even have to consciously think of anything. Mind will unconsciously release what's not helpful. So they can take a breath in, and on their exhale, think the word release. Or anything that's going to ground them in the present moment. Just if they're standing, like picking their toes up, standing on one leg, doing the pressure point, looking around and thinking, what can I steal? 5 things that I can get out of here and nobody would notice. Something that's going to keep mind engaged and grounded into their body. And also knowing that the sensation will release. So it's kind of like emotions are literally a wave. It'll come up, it'll peak, and it'll come down. It always, always, always comes down eventually. Sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes 90, sometimes 2 minutes, but it always comes down. So there's no wave so big that it cannot be ridden. We're very, very good surfers in mind. For something that in the moment feels very overwhelming, mantras can be quite useful. So repeating to mind, like be here now. It's much more useful to be present and clear than it is to be afraid. Not that fear isn't a natural response, it's just not a helpful one. Because when we're afraid, when we experience fear, all the blood drains from our mind and goes into our legs so that we can run fast. Very, very useful if you're a zebra running from a lion. Definitely not useful if you need to think. So the mantra, be here now. I can handle this. Whatever phrase is going to give them power in the moment is going to be very useful. Be here now. I can handle this. This will pass. Anything that cannot be denied. So something that's true. So where people get in trouble with mantras is they'll say things that aren't 100% true, which means subconscious will kick them out. So if they say, I can handle this, yes, because their track record for surviving is 100%. So that becomes true, that becomes accepted and integrated. But if they say something like, this will be easy, and mind is like, well, that ain't going to be easy, then it doesn't work, right? So I can handle this. My track record for survival is 100% because I assume they're alive and not a ghost. That would be weird. Or I don't know, maybe they're ghosts. The point is they're probably alive. So their track record for surviving is 100%. This will pass is a true statement. Anything that's true and feels useful. Does that make sense? I know I asked it again, but I want to make sure that it's understandable for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to be able to delve out some of these useful tools we can use in the field or in our personal lives.
For sure.
I always like the idea that a therapist is seeing you with the intention of having you be fired later on.
Yeah. Well, and that's something I run into a lot with therapists. And one of the reasons I don't do it that way is because it doesn't make sense to me to keep a client for 20 years and not have them improve. It's like, I don't know, cool, I guess, but that sounds terrible. I want people to improve. So what I discovered is that the more I teach, the faster people fire me. And the better I get at teaching, the faster people fire me. And, it's not like there's a shortage of people who need support. So that's not an issue. But like where I find that most therapists lack skill is in teaching. So therapists are actually only taught to listen, which is a huge problem. So like my entire grad school, so 3 years of training was how to listen, and none of it was how to teach. None of it. What am I supposed to do with that? Like, so then people come and they talk about their problems and they say, what do I do with it? And I say, I don't know, but I heard you. And then they walk away and they feel worse. And then they come back next week and they talk about their problems. They say, well, what do you think I should do? And I say, I don't know, but I heard you. And then it's just that forever. Like that makes no sense. So I learned to be a really good teacher because I want people to freaking never want to see me again. Like I want them to be like, Amanda, thank you so much, but I hope I never see you again. And I'm like, God, me too. Great. Go live a happy life.
I asked my therapist recently, I'm like, her memory is impeccable because she has a lot of clients, and the details she remembers from a while ago is it's interesting.
Yeah.
So I said to her, I mean, what's it feel like to get this shit dumped onto you all the time, all day, every day? Is it exhausting? She goes, it could be exhausting, but it's also rewarding to watch people get the tools they need to have an improved and better life. And so for me, it's very exciting, the challenge of it, to watch people get their lives back.
Literally. And it doesn't get dumped on, right? Like we develop boundaries, just like people don't take everything from work home, because you wouldn't be able to function. Like if cops took everything home, they would not be able to function. So you learn to leave things either where they are, leave them at work, leave them in your car, leave them on the side of the road, whatever. But like, it's like there's a table between you and I, and everything you bring comes onto the table, and we untangle spaghetti and we rearrange some things, and we just, set some things on fire just to get rid of it. But I don't keep it. It's not mine. I would be way less effective if I were carrying all of everyone's things. So there's just a table between you and I, and everything is on the table. And when you leave, it stays on the table. And when I leave, it stays on the table. But it is like watching people, teaching people to get their lives back and to like engage in life again is the funnest thing I could do.
What would you say to someone who knows they should start therapy, but is apprehensive to take that first step? I think people get there like, yeah, you know what? What is that breaking point for most people? They're like, I need to speak with somebody. Why do they let it get to that point?
My politically correct answer is as soon as you have the inkling, it's probably farther along than like sooner would have been better. Like the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, right? Second best time is today. My second thought is like, you can keep doing what you're doing and suffering forever. And like, you have that choice. It is your right to suffer forever. It just seems kind of stupid when like, you're uncomfortable for a few months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, but then you're happy. So it's like you have the choice and the option and the right to suffer. And why would you keep eating a cake full of razor blades when you can put it down whenever you want? That doesn't make any sense. So sometimes I think if I know of someone who's really suffering and they're being very stubborn about not reaching out, I honestly hope it gets worse so that then they're forced to get support. So not worse in terms of like they experience bodily harm, but I'm like, cool, I hope it sucks more for you, because if that's what you need to finally change things, then I hope it sucks a little more. And if there's the inkling, it doesn't hurt to try. The worst thing that happens is nothing. Well, the worst thing that happens is it gets worse, but definitely don't go see someone who doesn't know how to teach things, because that just makes no sense. More likely, maybe it'll stay the same, but more likely than that, it will get better. So why be stubborn about your suffering? Like, it just makes no sense. Why?
To me, it's like, I always use this analogy, and this is not per se, but there's always situations where I'm like, well, you're standing at a bar and there's a pretty girl at the other end of the bar.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and I think people can conclude, what do you have? You have two options.
Right.
You can talk to her or not talk to her. And we know what happens when you don't talk to her. That's a clear thing.
Right.
But we don't know what happens when you go and talk to her or him, whatever it may be, whatever you're interested in. So it's just that thing where we always talk about, I use that analogy and I just default right to that barroom setting, because I think people probably have the most difficult time speaking to the opposite sex as single human beings.
If you're straight,
correlate to that. It's a I think people can relate to that overall. I can see it in my kids. My kids will get nervous around girls,
Yeah.
except for the second one. He is smooth as fucking ice, that one.
Because he probably doesn't care. He's like, whatever happens, I'm unattached, which is one of the secrets, right? Is like, whatever happens to be unattached is like pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, right? And the more unattached you are, these are things that just happen. They don't define you. They don't become who you are. You are not them. You're just the person who experiences things. And the worst thing that happens is nothing changes. But it's not good now. Like, why would you stand in a fire and be like, I really think I should get out of this fire, but I'm going to stay and get burned a little more. Like, okay, then I hope it gets worse for you so that you get out of the damn fire. Like, hello, why? Just because it's the way you've done it doesn't mean it's the way it has to be done. Go be happy.
It's a shame that it takes people so much time that they could also often lose a lot of their life.
Oh my gosh.
Sitting in that place of, I know what I need to do, but I'm just not going to do it because I'm scared. And I can relate to the fact that it's very stressful, daunting, any word that you want to find a synonym to that, to maybe see somebody that you care about and try to get them to recognize the things that you're seeing, but maybe they're just so far gone or in such trauma or such, whatever you would like to call it, that the thought of it even cripples them more and they ignore it. What do you say to somebody like that?
That you can't save someone who's determined to drown in 3 inches of water. Right. What you can do is open a door and leave the door open and say, I hope you walk through this door and you deserve to walk through this door and you don't have to stay there. You can choose to stay there and people have a right to their suffering. It is a choice. If you take it from them, you disempower them more. That's not the goal. But they don't have to stay there. So what I like to think of it as planting seeds. And I have a lot of clients who experience this because they experience the growth and then they see people in their lives who are suffering and they say, what do I do? How do I help them? And I'm like, well, you can plant a vision and you can plant a dream and you can plant hope. And maybe it seeds and maybe it doesn't. But you can plant a lot of seeds and say, I hope this gets better for you. I hope you have the courage. Like I've had clients literally bring friends because they don't know, they've never done therapy. They don't know what it's like. They're really nervous. And I say, bring them to a session. Well, obviously you share as much as you want. I'll be as effective as I can. Don't share anything you don't want them to know, whatever. But like, then they get exposure and they say, oh, this isn't what I thought. Yeah, because we're sitting under a tree in my yard playing with miniature horses. Like it's not, So all people can do is open a door and plant a seed. It doesn't have to be this way, but they're the person who has to change it. And people deserve a right to their suffering, even if it sucks to watch. And it sucks to watch. But taking their suffering from them when that might be what they need to change does them no good.
Sometimes they take the suffering from themselves, huh?
Well, that's what a lot of it is, right? Like people who are scared, fear is a natural thing. Of course, it's not always useful. But yeah, a lot of times people build their own prisons in an effort to create safety. But too much safety is a prison. And that doesn't help anybody.
I can't tell you how many people I've given my therapist number to.
and some reach out and some don't. Yeah.
One reached out thus far, and everybody continues to have the excuses. And, listen, I have enough experience, I think, in life. And I think that I'm intelligent enough to recognize patterns, symptoms, behaviors. And oftentimes some of my friends are like, I know what my vices are. I know what I'm doing. And I'm like, yeah, I understand. But if you have to understand, I just asked you before what you would want out of life, and the behaviors that you're acting on or engaging in are not going to result in the thing that you want, that you've expressed as what you want.
And that's where there's a block, right? Is like, that's where conscious gets it and unconscious doesn't. So it's like people will say, oh, I want a good relationship. And they keep choosing bozos. And it's like, well, what you actually want is a pattern because it feels comfortable and it feels safe, as in it's nothing new. So they say they want good, happy, wonderful, healthy relationship. But what they choose is Bozo the clown, because there's a conflict between what they say they want and what the deeper part that runs the show, unconscious wants.
Yeah. I would also like to sprinkle in impatience.
Yes. And as someone who I think my karmic lesson in this lifetime is patience, I'm incredibly impatient. But that's also why, like, I just do the thing that's helpful because I want to get better, feel better, get what I want now. I always want what I want now. I'm very much a brat in that way. I'm like, I want it now.
Do
So
you love
like,
Amazon? Do you love Amazon?
I don't like Jeff Bezos, but I do like Amazon. I love their two.
Wait, hold on. What don't you like about Jeff Bezos?
Oh, he could do a lot of good and he chooses not to, and that's very frustrating to me.
I would. All I would say is, I think anytime we want to judge somebody about that, we should offer Jeff Bezos an opportunity to explain himself.
Oh my God, I would love to talk to him. If anyone has a contact, call her, it's your girl. And but like, you're the person in charge of getting what you want, right? So it's like, be impatient about that. Go be impatient about being the person in charge of getting what you want. So then it's like, then people who don't get help because they're impatient actually just have more of the same problem. They don't get what they want. But what do they want? They want not to change. They want to not do the work. They want to not be uncomfortable. So then they end up being uncomfortable forever. And it just makes no sense.
Isn't the world a very interesting place? And the reality is, is none of us are taught these things as children. I would argue that.
Yes.
And by the way, who was going to teach them to you? But who was going to teach them to you, right? So I had this conversation with a friend of mine from where I live now, and he's from the town that I grew up in next to it. And it's a little bit of a step down from the town that I grew up in. So we were having a conversation. I'm like, the reality is like, can you think of one person who was in your childhood in the towns we grew up in, like really embracing and preaching stoicism and thoughtfulness and kindness and behavior? No, like nobody. Yeah. And if you found one, who was it? I don't even know. Like, later on in life, I have found that it's so interesting to me that essentially it may be rare in somebody's life that they get somebody to give them perspective and
I'll give them a helpful perspective.
Right.
Because people give perspectives all the time, but sometimes they're terrible, which is where like you come in, right? Sharing this wisdom, this knowledge, and saying, hey, you don't have to adopt this perspective. If it makes sense to you, try it on. If you like it, keep doing. And if you don't, whatever, leave it on the table. But thank God for the internet.
I was just going to say that. You fucking took the words out of my mouth. You fucker. You just literally stole that from me. It was in my mind. Literally going to say, thank God for the internet.
Listen, I have access to any information I want. And some people never look, which is another perspective mindset thing, right? But I'm just like, what do you mean? Like, everything is there. Anything you want to learn. Thank God for the internet. I was just in Cuba for a few days. Listen, the things that we have access to in the US, I don't want to hear anyone say how hard anything is ever again. Ever. Like, oh, I can't do that because I don't know how. Hello, Google exists. Like, Google it. Find someone smarter than you. Listen to a podcast. Do something. Do anything. You're not helpless, but so many people are taught they are. And it's just like, oh. No.
It's a lot of undoing, and it's got to be the right person who's willing to be undone, right? To rebuild them back.
It's a willingness. And it's working through fears and perspectives and old programming, which is where we're saying the right thing in the right way at the right time.
I'm also going to throw in the variable of I think there actually has to be intelligence as well. And so
intelligent just depends on what it is, right?
I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know if I agree. I mean, I think there's different levels of intelligence. So
for sure, yeah.
I have found, honestly, this may be crazy to say this. This is my personal experience, that I think that unintelligence or a lack of the ability to understand something also correlates with people who have very little emotional intelligence as well. So I see a lot of frustration with somebody. It's wild. I mean, I could name, I wouldn't do that here publicly, but I could name 5 people that I know that are just, and I'm not saying there are independently emotionally unintelligent people who are actually super intelligent. I'm saying typically when I see somebody that I know who is unintelligent, and I mean like they're clearly not as smart as everybody else. And I don't mean that from a
there's
perspective of like special education. I'm saying just functional, but like just not getting things. They seem to be very offended by a lot of things that they don't understand, and causes frustration. It's so interesting to me that I think it's like when we look at things, we're like, this is the mystery of the world. How do people not see it this way when you're smart, right? How do people not understand what we're saying?
And so sometimes what I see is people can be too smart and then they'll talk themselves into problems. And if people don't know how to regulate, how to calm their nervous system, then anytime they run, because confusion brings discomfort. And so people will typically run from discomfort, which means they run from confusion. And what they'll say is, I don't understand. And they may not, but it's because understanding would take perseverance, would take riding discomfort, or it would take shifting a perspective that has been protecting them, that they grew up with, that they don't want to unseat because, oh, now they don't know, and not knowing is uncomfortable. So you're exactly right that like not being good at emotional intelligence or not being good at emotional embodiment, the ability to feel and manage emotions, creates stucknesses because they're not, people avoid anything that's uncomfortable. And what if it is uncomfortable is expanding their perspective, expanding their mindset, growing, changing things, then they'll say, well, I just don't understand. And it's not because they're stupid. It's because they don't know how to deal with discomfort. And sometimes people literally don't understand. Like there's things that I don't understand and I'm intelligent, right? Obviously.
Me and you both.
Right. Yeah. There's like some things that I'm like, oh, what the fuck is nuclear physics? I don't know. But people will run from discomfort. That's a natural human tendency. And so instead of understanding and moving through the discomfort, not pushing through, moving through, they'll just avoid it. And so then ignorance, right? They say ignorance is bliss, but really ignorance feels safer. Not that it's bliss, because it's pretty hard to work through life and not understand anything. But it feels safer. And this is how people build a prison with the intention to build safety. And it's just not useful at all. So you're exactly right. Emotional intelligence helps logical intelligence. And we do want both. People that are too logical tend to get themselves in trouble. People that are too emotional get themselves in trouble. We want the Goldilocks, the happy medium.
Yeah. And, I think that as you're saying this, birds of a feather flock together. And so what essentially that means is like, yeah, you find other people that enable that will enable the bullshit, shitty behavior that you're displaying. And they'll go along with you.
Because people don't like discomfort, right? If I'm acting in a bullshit way and you call me out and I'm like, ew, gross, why would you call me out? I'm just going to avoid you, right? Because people avoid discomfort. So it's like learning to ride discomfort is like one of the most valuable tools people can learn, hands down. I do want to tell you, though, I do have to run in a couple minutes.
Okay.
So there was...
All right, last questions. Where can people find you and do you have openings?
Openings. Yes. So kind of is the right word. So why I reached out is I'm actually in the process of building, and it'll launch in January, a program specifically for first responders for like emotional regulation and like literally clearing trauma. So it'll be both by topic. So let's say like they run a child fatality. They had someone die, like things like that. Or by quote. So it'll be like, oh, I'm 7 minutes into shift and I already want to like fucking bounce. So specifically for first responders, they'll have access to me. They'll have access to support coaches who are also trained who are first responders, which is dope AF. I'm so freaking stoked about it. And
I love it.
So, yes. So it is going to be so good. I'm like, it feels like eating a ribeye. It's so exciting. And if they want to work with me personally, they can just, they can find me on Instagram, honestly, is probably the best way, at Amanda_Chils, CHILS. So like when you get cold, but just a little, because it's only one L. And the program is called Exhale and Release. So that can be found at exhaleandrelease.com. There's multiple tracks. They're going to want the first responder track. And it's like tailored to. So we love that for them. And we love that for them. That'll be very exciting. So that'll launch in January. So exhaleandrelease.com is going to be the best space.
Excellent. You give me a lot of good ideas too.
Oh, yeah, good. Yeah. If you if you need anything, just holler.
I am going to holler. You'll see.
Okay. Oh, exciting. Fun. Yeah.
Go do your thing.
Thank you so much. Like this was so lovely.
Cool. Yeah, it was awesome. Thank you so much. Bye, Amanda.
Bye.
Hey guys, check out our upcoming training at streetcop.com. Don't forget, we have 50 instructors nationally teaching a variety of topics. These are the best classes you're going to experience in your career. We make sure of it. You're going to love it. I guarantee you're going to be thankful that you went. Check us out at streetcop.com for all upcoming classes in your area.